Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Welcome, everybody. Mike, Kenny, and Jim with you today, and we're back, as always, talking a little truck safety. Thanks for joining us, as always. And what our focus is going to be today on this episode is Brake Safety Week. The CVSA's Brake Safety Week is coming up August 20th through the 26th. And as we talk about Brake Safety Week, the guys are going to get us lined out on that in just a minute. But as I've been thinking about it over the last few days, there's a couple of words that come to mind, and those were trust and accountability. So in our society, we put a lot of trust in people every day. We put a lot of trust in processes and procedures as well. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The three of us, we all travel for our jobs. And I know we're not jumping on a plane every week to go somewhere. We travel by vehicle quite a bit. But when we do have to get on a plane, we're trusting that the mechanics have inspected that aircraft thoroughly, and that the pilots have been well trained and they're meticulous in their pre-flight checklist as well. And we're trusting that they've got the skill to get us from point A to point B. And another example, if there's ever a time in life when we need to have surgery, we're trusting that medical staff has been well trained, that the anesthesiologist administers the correct amount of medicine so that we don't wake up in the middle of their operating procedure. We trust that surgeon knows our specific issues after talking with us and getting a proper diagnosis, and that they are precise in their work and they're following through with all of their checks and balances. We put a lot of trust in those folks. And it's interesting, it's been several years ago, my wife was having a surgery, and I can verify this, but surgeons will actually mark a patient's body based on where they need to operate. So they don't operate on the wrong arm or leg when they go in. And if they're supposed to be operating on the right shoulder, they don't go in and start trying to fix the left shoulder that there's nothing wrong with. So there's a checks and a balance there for them. And we're putting a trust in that process, and we're putting a trust in that surgeon. And in the end, we're trusting that we'll come out of that operating room with, a problem fixed and a better shot at life, hopefully. So these things happen in a significant number each day, and the amount of training and accountability that for things like flying airplanes and performing operations is important, because it's a matter of life and death. And in our industry, the transportation industry, it's no different. There are millions of commercial motor vehicles operating out on the roadway, and everyone on the road is trusting that the mechanics have done a thorough inspection of those trucks, those trailers. We're trusting that the drivers have been trained to do their inspections and to know when their trucks are safe to operate and when they're not. And we're trusting that the companies are making investments into their operations to make sure that their trucks and trailers are safe to operate. Well, the CVSA is giving us another opportunity to bring the importance of vehicle safety to the forefront. And as I mentioned before, that Brake Safety Week scheduled for August 20th through the 26th, the inspectors are going to be out there focusing on the brake systems of the trucks. And I'm sitting here with a wealth of knowledge, and Kenny and Jim, and I'll pose this question to you guys, and you jump in however you want to, but I want to pose this question. How do our listeners, as drivers, as mechanics, as owners of trucking companies, how do we prep for Brake Safety Week that's coming up here?
Mike, and I love the analogy you made to both flying an aircraft and doctors performing surgery, and it's the preparation of that ahead of time. And I think one thing our motor carriers, whether that's the owner of the company, the safety director, the maintenance director, whoever at the company may be tasked with the preparation for Brake Safety Week, I think it's beneficial for just a moment to try in their mind, put the hat on of CVSA and say, why are we doing this? Why do they carve out a week where they publicize ahead of time and they dedicate resources nationwide to checking brakes? And ultimately, if you talk to any of the folks at CVSA, they'll tell you our goal is to reduce crashes. So even though we do want to have that trust within our industry that mechanics are doing what they're supposed to do, drivers are doing proper pre-trips, companies are committed to a safe program, we want to have the trust that that's being done. It's kind of like President Reagan used to say about the Russians. We're going to trust them, but we're also going to verify. And this is a week of verification. And so to help reduce crashes, what CVSA does during this week is a two-pronged process. First of all, they're going to identify defects. They're going to find violations. They do that by having this blitz of roadside inspections. The other thing they do is an education process. And fortunately, we're part of that. We're not formally tasked by CVSA, but even our podcast, part of this is the education of our industry about why it's important to have safe brakes and why CVSA does this nationwide, really continent-wide, because it's Mexico, U.S., and Canada doing this. Why do we do this? And again, the reason is CVSA will just simply tell you, two-word response: reduce crashes. We don't want any truck crashes caused by defective brakes. And Mike, I think it's interesting. You mentioned the dates of August 20th to 26th. I want people to look at their calendar and realize that is a full week. The 20th is on a Sunday, and it runs till Saturday the 26th. So we're talking about 7 full days. And folks need to know what's going to happen during those full days, because states that have ports of entry, they're going to open their scales, they're going to open their inspection sites, and some of them literally will commit to running 24 hours a day for that full 7-day period. They'll bring troopers in, inspectors in from other areas. They'll man those stations. Other states will just do routine roadside inspection, but they'll collect the data to upload. My home state of Texas, what they'll do is all of the troopers will have to work that week. We don't have ports of entry in Texas, but we do have scale locations across our state. And then the majority of our troopers work roving patrol, but there won't be anybody off that week. Everybody will be working, and we'll actually have troopers out 24 hours a day during that 7-day period checking trucks. What's different about that week? You and I always discuss, coming out of the regulatory community, there is one thing from a regulatory perspective that changes during any of these emphasis weeks, and that is that in addition to doing the regular roadside inspections and finding violations, states that have judicial activity attached to their inspections, I mean tickets, you'll find that they're going to note every violation they find. And with this being a brake safety week, if they find very egregious brake violations, they're going to actually issue a ticket to the driver, which means in addition to the violation report he gets, the roadside inspection report, that driver's going to end up having to contact a judge, have to contact a court. There's going to be a fine associated with that, plus all the regular CSA points that come. The other thing that's different about a brake safety week or any emphasis week that CVSA does is that the out of service criteria is rigorously enforced. And what I mean by that, every driver that listens to this podcast has had a trooper somewhere cut them a brake. They may be 15 or 20 miles from their yard, and the trooper says, listen, you're out of service, but I'm going to put you out of service at the yard. I'm going to let you go on this 15 miles. Or there's a truck stop 5 miles down the road. I'm going to follow you to that truck stop. That's not going to happen during brake safety week. If they're out of service, they're going to get the red sticker stuck right smack dab in the middle of the driver's side of the windshield, and that truck's going to be fixed there, or it's going somewhere on the back of a wrecker. So the two things that drivers really need to know is there's going to be tickets issued in addition to the roadside inspection reports, and the out of service is going to be rigorously enforced. And one thing, and you and I can discuss this more, however you want to take the lead on this, the two types of inspections we're going to see, they're either going to be level 1s or level 4s, probably level 1s, because if they go to the trouble to get under it on a creeper or pull it over a pit, they're going to go ahead and check the whole truck. Some states, to get more inspections, will simply do level 4s, where all they check will be the driver's license, the med card, the things that take place at the door, and then they simply look at the brakes and nothing else. But the drivers need to be prepared. These inspections are going to be the ones where a trooper's either going to be under it on a creeper, or they're going to pull across a pit and the inspector will be under it in a pit. But the main thing I want motor carriers and drivers to know is there's going to be a lot of tickets issued during this week where you actually have to contact a judge, contact a court, and the out of service will be thoroughly enforced. But again, our goal is reduce crashes. And they do that by verifying that trust you were talking about, that we have a reason to have that trust. And then also the educational thrust of this. One reason they publicize it so far ahead and provide so much material is they're telling everybody, hey, this is coming. And so when it happens, you really have no excuse for not being prepared.
And we talked about this on an earlier podcast when some of the other CVSA's weeks that they sponsor. It's we get the answers to the test. I mean, we know it's coming, and it's a chance to prepare. It's a chance to go through your fleet to get the trucks, the trailers, everything in top shape and ready to go. And I wanted to follow up, Jim, and jump in here anytime, but I wanted to follow up with a couple of stats. And this is coming from the CVSA has already done their unannounced brake safety day this year. And I've got some numbers for some of the violations that they saw. And so the top 3 brake related out of service conditions were, the first one was the 20% brakes violation. And this is just a vehicle or combination of vehicles declared out of service when 20% or more of its service brakes have an out of service condition resulting in a defective brake. So that was the top one. The second one was just other brake violations. That's a pretty broad category. But examples would be brake lines that are worn, broken brake drums, inoperative tractor protection systems. So it just kind of a catch-all. That's a pretty broad category. And then the third one was a steering brake violation. It's a standalone out of service steering axle brake violation. So those were the top 3 out of service with the unannounced brake safety day that they've already held this year. But when you look through and see what things to come, they're not going to find anything different on this brake safety week than they're finding right there. So, you can go back and look on the CVSA's website and see, well, what kind of things do they look for? What kind of things do they see? Well, you can go on there and look and kind of see what they did last year, what kind of violations they wrote, what was the most common types of violations. And then you can look at the stats from this unannounced safety brake or this brake safety day and see the very same statistics and information there. So it's a good resource to go and look at just to give you an idea of what types of violations are written, because the brake systems on these trucks and trailers, I mean, there's a lot to them, and there's a lot of different types of violations that can be written for sure. But Jim, I don't know what your thought process was coming into this, but I know that you've got a background in the maintenance and the shop preparation for weeks like this. What kind of tips do you got for the listeners out there on this brake safety week?
Well, I tell you, after listening to you guys talk, my first set of sheets of notes just gets thrown out the window because you give me all these new ideas. And I love the trust and accountability that you brought in at the beginning, and then it just kind of built on what Kenny was saying. So I guess I'm just going to do the bluff version of the bottom line up front of what my notes were. And the big picture for preparation is we can never underestimate the significance of communication between the drivers and the technicians. Drivers that are out on the road, they might be the first one to notice an issue with the truck. And being able to have that communication with the technician at the maintenance shop, where and when and what happened and whatever details might be there is going to set that technician or that maintenance guy or gal up for success in diagnosing these vehicles. And another thing is approaching this inspection week and our maintenance program together or holistically. Interconnected systems such as brakes and advanced safety technologies or systems, any element that inspector may search for during this week is consequential and could be indicative of larger maintenance issues. So we got to take that seriously. If something's wrong here, we talked about animal wounds, how a leg can affect something in the head, and the same thing with the human body. A knee can start to affect the hip. The brake inspections that we're looking at could be indicative of other issues that are going on. So the operator and the technician staying on top of pre, post, and regular inspections is going to go a long way in preparing for this week. and is going to catch some of those obvious violations like the loose hoses or damaged components. Following your every day, your every week, and every month inspection is going to set you up on a path to success. The CVSA website has many different tools available, not only for the driver, but also the technician. Air brake push rod stroke brochures. There's brake inspection checklists, brake postcards, the PBBT brochure, and testers that are available on the website. So a lot of information there to go dig into and get set up for this coming week.
You know, Jim, when you mentioned about consequences and that certain violations may be indicative of kind of the general health of a motor carrier, one thing that the owners that are listening to this podcast, and we get phenomenal feedback from owners, safety directors, and even drivers, but the owners out there need to know that these trucks that get inspected that just have a large number of violations, there's a very, very good chance that trooper is going to check the box on his or her inspection report to refer that motor carrier for an audit, for a follow-up audit. There will be a lot of compliance reviews. Some of them will be focused. Some of them will be the full meal deal. But there'll be a lot of compliance reviews that end up coming out of these inspections that are going to take place. And, you know, Mike, you went over those three main areas that they found. Drivers need to know that 20% to be out of service. There's three main areas that when a truck's being inspected from the brake perspective that drivers need to be aware of. That 20%, and I know none of us on here are mathematicians, but a regular 18-wheeler, let's just talk about a 5-axle rig. It has 10 brakes. It has 5 axles, 2 brakes on each axle, okay? So you got 10 brakes. 20%, that's if you have 2 or more that are defective, you've met the 20% criteria. That's 2 or more anywhere on that truck. So what they're looking for there to meet that out of service criteria or to meet the definition of a defective brake, it's push rod travel that's too much. It's wheel grease that's leaked onto a drum. It's an inoperative brake. It's a air leak at a brake chamber. It's anything. It's broken pads, broken components. It's anything that's right there at the brake itself on the wheel. That's what goes into the calculation for the 20% to be out of service. Those other brake violations that you talked about, you start in the cab of the tractor. That's everything from the emergency brake, it's low air warning device, it's compressor leak, air leaks, it's anything from the foot pedal of that brake all the way back to the actual brake on the wheel. That's what falls into all those other violations. And then the third major one they find is problems on the steering axle itself. There are certain brakes certain brake violations on the steering axle that will fall into the out of service completely by themselves, exempt, totally separate from the 20%. Things like an inoperative brake on the steering axle, mismatched sizes on brake pods, or mismatched stroke lengths on the the air brake stroke whenever you're measuring push rod travel. And the purpose behind that, if you think about that, you don't even have to be a physicist to understand this, but if you've got one brake that's working on the steering axle, but the other one does, that driver has to apply emergency brake. Well, the one that's going to grab is going to basically stop that tire from rolling. The other one's going to keep, and it's going to pivot around the one, and it basically functions almost like a blowout happens on a steering. It's almost uncontrollable. And that's why some of the steering axle brakes have out of service criteria in and of themselves. So again, for the drivers out there and the mechanics that listen to our podcast, you need to think about those three areas that we're looking for: defective brakes in and of themselves, standalone, the 10 brakes on a 5-axle rig. We're looking at all the components everywhere from the foot pedal back to the brake chamber. And then we special attention on the steering axle itself. And, those are the three violations that were found most often on the one day unannounced. And just like Mike said, those are going to be exactly the same violations they're going to find this time. And back on the one day unannounced in May, approximately 11% of all U.S. trucks that got inspected during that one-day blitz got put out of service. Y'all think about that. As we go up and down the highway, everybody listening to this podcast has been up and down the highway and have seen trucks lined up to go into a scale or an inspection site somewhere. When the light's on the interstate says all trucks next right, well, you just basically count as you pass by that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You count 10 trucks. One of those 10 is fixing to get put out of service. That is an enormous amount of trucks that get put out of service. 10%. That tells you on that trust factor Mike talked about, there's 10% of them out there we can't trust because stats tell us they're defective. And on that one-day inspection, they inspected almost 6,000 trucks nationwide on that one day. So now we're looking at a 7-day operation. You do the math, there's going to be over 40,000 trucks that are going to be inspected during that week in August. So, you know, our industry is without excuse because it's well publicized. We know what they're looking for. We know how they do the inspection, and it's up to us as an industry to get ready.
And, you know, Kenny, you mentioned just talking about the steering brake violations and when you were talking about mismatched slack adjuster length or maybe even mismatched chambers, it kind of goes back to what Jim was talking about in that accountability between the shop and the drivers and the communication that has to happen there, because there's some of those things that a driver may not be able to determine by themselves when they're doing their pre-trip. And that's one of the things for sure is the measurements on the push rod travel. I mean, a driver, that's something you can't do by yourself. You've got to have 2 people to do that. So that's something that the mechanics or a third-party shop's going to have to do, and the motor carrier's got to be on top of their maintenance program to make sure that stuff's getting checked. It's you know, we've talked about this before, but I mean, a lot of drivers, they've been driving a long time, that you can kind of tell by the angle of the push rod coming out of the chamber whether it's out of adjustment or not, but you really have no idea if it's within the thresholds that CVSA allows to be out of service or not, or a brake being out of adjustment. So that's just one of those areas where it's really important for drivers to communicate back to the companies. Here's some things I see that we need to get fixed as part of the brake system, the Kenny, that you outlined, that goes from the brake pedal all the way back to the very last chamber on the trailer. And then the mechanics need to communicate with the company as well and saying, well, okay, we've done our inspection and here's some things that we need to fix. And the owners are going to have to then say, yeah, this is a priority. This is important to us. We need to invest in our equipment. We need to get this fixed. We can't put this truck out there and it be part of that 10% that Kenny was talking about that's going to get put out of service because we didn't want to invest in making sure that our equipment's up to snuff when it comes to safety. So one of the things that I was thinking about, Kenny, as you were talking about those trucks being lined up to go into a scale house, I've got my mentor and my old supervisor when I just started on the regulatory side. His name is Gene Crandall, and he had been doing inspections for a long time. And when he retired, he gave me a stack of pictures that they took when they were doing roadside inspections back in the late 70s and early 80s. And they're just a bunch of Polaroid pictures with different violations and things like that. And they would write on there who the motor carrier was, what the violation was found. That's how they documented it. You know, obviously no cell phones, no other way, but that's how they documented the violations. And I will say that these weeks like this, the attention to motor vehicle safety, commercial motor vehicle safety, and the maintenance programs, things like that are working, because you go back and look at some of those pictures back in the late 70s, early 80s of what kind of shape that the trucks were in and what kind of violations were run up and down the road. It would floor you. I mean, it just, and I know, you know, Kenny, because you saw that stuff run up and down the road, but I would say we're doing a better job because there's more trucks, there's more trailers, there's a lot more stuff going on out there. We're doing better than we used to, but still there's, even 10, 15 years ago, before I got out of doing inspections, things like that, I mean, we would still see, you crawl under a truck and see a spring brake hanging out of a chamber. I crawl right back out of there and get away from that thing and say, okay, that's one of those brakes it's defective. It's going to go against you 20%. And so it's interesting how things have evolved and how we're doing better, but yet we still got 10% of the trucks are going to be put out of service out there on the road. So still a lot of work to do.
Yep.
Well, gentlemen, any other advice for our listeners out there?
there's a lot of different terms that are thrown around about a principle. I'm going to share with y'all real quick and I'll be done, but I like to call it constructive discontent. And that is where we are never happy with the status quo and we always want to get better. And the fact that we've still got 10% of the trucks in our industry running up and down the road. It actually, during that one-day break unannounced in May, it was 11%. So think about that. If we were all in school, if the trucking industry was in school as a student, it means that we never made an A, because 11% would put us at 89% of compliance. So our industry is not even able to get an A, and we shouldn't be happy with that. We should not accept that. That ought to be unacceptable to us. And so that constructive discontent is, I'm not happy with our industry. I'm not mad at anybody, but it embarrasses me that we can't make an A, that 11% of the trucks running up and down the road are not worthy to be on the road. And it makes us question that trust issue that you started the entire episode with, about how can we trust our industry until we get that number down, that out of service. That ought to just drive us constantly to want to be better. So I have constructive discontent right now. And when I say our industry, we're part of this industry. We're not on the outside pointing a finger in. We're part of this industry. We're proudly part. We love the trucking industry, but we've got room for improvement. And I just want to encourage the people listening to our podcast, let's get on board and improve.
Yeah. And the reason why a B is not good enough is because, just like I said before, it really is a matter of life and death. I mean, we've got to have the mindset of, when we're out there as drivers, as companies, if you own a company, you not only want your driver to come home safe at night, but you're also thinking about the others that are out there on the road. And that's something that I feel like we've got a responsibility to do, all of us in this industry, is be as safe as we can and have that mindset that we want to protect life. I mean, that's always something that we should be thinking about. You know, coming from the risk management world, I know we talk a lot about regulatory issues in here and being prepared, being in compliance, but there's another aspect of this is, the industry that we happen to work for in the insurance world. If you have an accident and you may be out of compliance with your vehicle maintenance, and maybe your brake system wasn't up to snuff on your truck, maybe you're one of that 10 or 11% that had an out of service violation, you just hadn't been inspected yet, and you're involved in an accident. That's a significant issue that you're going to have to face now, because that truck's going to be inspected post-accident. If it was a DOT recordable accident, they're going to determine whether or not if the brake systems were a part of what caused the crash, what caused the accident. And if it was, then now you've got a significant issue that could have been alleviated with a strong maintenance program. And as Jim said, everybody communicating together, the mechanics looking the trucks over, the drivers doing the proper pre-trips, and making sure that those trucks are in top operating condition. So that's I don't really want to go down too far a negative road and thinking about that stuff, but it's obviously, I know if you're listening to us, you're an owner of a trucking company. I don't have to tell you to think about this stuff, because I know you think about it every day. But worst case scenario, if your truck gets involved in an accident, you want to make sure that it wasn't because it was mechanically unsound and that's why you had the accident. That's something that's within our control to fix, and we want to make sure that the trucks are in good operating condition. So
you bet.
Jim, any parting thoughts for the listeners?
You get what you inspect, not what you expect, comes to mind. You know, this is a time, a operational tempo. I lean back on my military time in our maintenance shops. It is not easy. When we are pushing our equipment to do day after day what we need it to do, what it was designed to do, there are enough hazards on the road that cause items to break. And unless we are being aware, we need to trust but verify. But if we are not staying on top of it and wholeheartedly communicating with our maintenance between the technicians and the drivers and addressing those issues, we just become another hazard on the roadway.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate your all's expertise and sharing with our listeners today. I know the information you provided is extremely valuable. I always appreciate it when I get to sit down and talk with you guys. One of my favorite things to do. So appreciate you more than you know. And I want to thank all of our listeners out there. Thanks for joining us today. And more importantly, thank you for valuing safety at your company. I just want to invite you to catch us next time as we talk about some hazards that may be present when schools are starting back up and how we can be as safe as possible with some of our most precious cargo out there, and that would be our kids going back to school. So until then, catch us next time right here on Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.